To understand a really important logical fallacy that comes out of deduction, let's look at deductive reasoning in a different format. We can call this the if-then format rather than the syllogism. And to understand this, here are two terms you need to know. The antecedent, which I will always put in green to make it easier for you, and the consequent. The antecedent, as the name tells you, that beginning part ante, tells you it comes before, and that's the first part of our argument. And it is the antecedent that produces the consequent. The consequent is a result or a consequence of the antecedent. So to give you an example of this, remember Aristotle's syllogism, all humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. So what's the antecedent here? In that major premise, all humans are mortal. What's the antecedent and what's the consequent? Well, you can ask yourself, does being a human make Socrates mortal? Or does being mortal make Socrates human? Obviously, being human makes Socrates mortal. The antecedent is being human. The consequent of being human is mortality. It doesn't work the other way around because being mortal doesn't automatically make Socrates a human, because animals, plants, everything living in this world is mortal. So the antecedent is being human, and as a consequence of being human, it is also true that Socrates is mortal. So there are a number of ways that we can approach an argument in order to try to confirm whether the argument is telling us, is giving us truth, is revealing truth. The first way is to affirm the antecedent. Here we look at what comes first and we say, is it true or is it false? And if it's true, what does that mean for the consequent? If it's false, what does that mean for the consequent? In the next couple of examples, we will affirm the consequent, meaning that we will say yes. We will affirm the antecedent. I've abbreviated as AA. So we're going to say that yes, it turns out the antecedent in these arguments is true. Therefore, what will be the effect on the consequent? Well, since the consequent is a result of the antecedent, if the antecedent is true, then the consequent must also be true. And we know that with 100% certainty, and so we call this a valid argument. Let me give you an example to try to make this clear, and I'll put it in if-then format. So if Kepler is a cat, then Kepler has claws. The antecedent is being a cat. The consequent of that is having claws, because all cats have claws. So here is Kepler. We look at Kepler, and through empiricism, we can affirm that yes, Kepler is a cat. Well, if we know that Kepler is a cat, therefore we also know, as a consequence of that the consequent must be true. Kepler must have claws. Okay? So if the antecedent is true, then we know the consequent is true with 100% certainty, and this is a valid argument. Let me give you another example that goes back to what you learned about dinosaurs. If Diplodocus was a sauropod, then it must have had a forward-facing pubic bone. The antecedent is being a sauropod. The consequent that comes from being a sauropod is that you must have a forward-facing pubic bone. So yes, Diplodocus was a sauropod. We can tell that from, remember, the thin peg-like teeth that we see. And if then we know, we've affirmed the antecedent, yes, Diplodocus was a sauropod, therefore we also know that the consequent is true Diplodocus had a forward-facing pubic bone. We can confirm that with observations. Here is the ischium pointing backwards and the pubic bones pointing forward. And we know that even without having seen that, we already knew that with 100% certainty, because that's a consequent of the antecedent that Diplodocus was a sauropod. Here's another example. If Pachyrhinosaurus was a dinosaur, and let's do a quick little detour into naming. Dinosaurs have fascinating names, and they come from Greek and Latin and other languages now that all mean something about the dinosaur. Saurus means lizard. Rhino, I think we may have talked about this already. If you think about a rhinoceros, rhino, it has a horn on its nose, and rhino means nose. Pachy means hard. So this name literally means hard-nosed lizard, and you will see why when we see a picture of Pachyrhinosaurus. But for us now, if Pachyrhinosaurus was a dinosaur, then it had its legs under its body. We already saw that one of the criteria for being a dinosaur is that you have your legs under your body. So if it's true, if the antecedent is true that Pachyrhinosaurus is a dinosaur, then the consequent that it had its legs under its body must also be true. And yes, I will tell you Pachyrhinosaurus was a dinosaur, and therefore without me having to tell you, what do you now know with 100% certainty? You now know that Pachyrhinosaurus had its legs under its body. Even without having ever seen it, without knowing it empirically, you know it rationally. But we can confirm this empirically. Here is Pachyrhinosaurus, and I mentioned about the hard nose because this dinosaur had a very thick, bony growth on the area above its nostrils, and that's where it gets its name from. But you can confirm from that empirically that that Pachyrhinosaurus had its legs under its body. You already knew that rationally because we had a valid argument here. We were affirming the antecedent.